Greetings, fellow humans, and welcome to the channel which is passionate about all things automobiles. The main focus of today's video will be breathing. And no, this ain't turning into no yoga channel. I am, of course, talking about crankcase breathing. Now, some of you, or all of you in the comments, may have noticed that my valve cover is in need of a bit of a refinish after a few years sitting next to that blazing hot EFR turbo. But I'm also going to be performing some modifications to the valve cover that's going to help the crankcase on the VVT Beast breathe a little bit better. You see, the Miata and pretty much all cars have a crankcase breather system. They have the PCV valve, but they also have just an open breather. So the PCV valve actually closes in boost, and the engine cannot breathe through that port at all during the most important time, which is in boost. That's why it's got another breather over on the driver's side that's just open all the time. And it lets out the pressure that's created by what's called blowby. What is blowby? Well, okay, so there's a lot of pressure in your cylinders when the engine is running, especially when the engine is making more power. And a certain percentage of that pressure is always going to leak through the gap in the piston rings down into the crankcase, and that pressure has to go somewhere. Now, your pistons have to have a gap, so when they get hot and they expand, the ends cannot touch each other, because if the piston ring ends touch each other, that is basically instant engine failure, and you don't want that. Now, on a car that is turbocharged, let's say one that's making 4 times the factory power, like the engine in the red car, you've got a lot more cylinder pressure, so of course more air and more pressure is going to make it into the crankcase. But what makes that situation even worse is on an engine that makes more horsepower, you actually have to have a larger gap on the piston rings to account for the extra heat, which means more piston ring expansion. So now you've got a lot more pressure in the cylinders and a bigger gap for that pressure to go through. And the breather system on the Miata is still 100% factory, which means it's engineered perfectly for 100 horsepower, but not 400. So I'm going to address that situation today. Some of the issues that can be caused by this are excessive leaking through your oil seals, and in an extreme case, you could actually blow one of the seals out. Now, this happened to me on my 1.6 liter setup. The engine had well over 200,000 miles. It was tired, I know that, and I know it had a lot of blowby and crankcase pressure. Well, what happened during one of my dyno sessions is a cam seal actually blew completely out, and the engine started leaking a lot of oil, and I had no idea what was going on. I was like, crap, I just need to get the car home and then I can figure it out later. So I stuffed a bunch of rags into the splash guard to catch the oil. Probably had to put about 2 quarts of oil in the car on the 100-mile drive home. Got home and realized that it was just a few 10 millimeters to pull the valve cover off, and I could have popped that cam seal back into place. So that's just an example of how much pressure can actually build up in the crankcase and in the, underneath the valve cover. And the VVT Beast engine, it does leak some oil, and I think that could be a contributing factor. So today I'll be modifying the valve cover to breathe a little bit better, as well as updating my catch can setup. So without further ado, let's whip out my favorite tool, the drill. All right, so let's take a look at my demo engine here. I love that I just have a demo engine in my garage now. I still don't even know what I'm gonna put this in, but that's for later deciding. So what I wanna take a quick look at here is how the stock breather system works, so you have a better understanding of what I'm trying to achieve by modifying my valve cover and breather system on my turbo car. On all Miatas, over on the intake side, you've got a port, and that has the PCV valve within it. And then over on the intake side, you've got another port, and this doesn't have anything in it. It's just an open tube that runs into the intake, or if you have a catch can, it might go to your catch can. Now, there's a couple different ways to set up a catch can. I'll get into that a little bit later in the video. But for the factory system, let's talk about the PCV real quick. Now, the PCV valve remains open basically just during cruise, and I think it's open at idle as well, and it helps vent out some crankcase pressure. In fact, the intake manifold actually will pull a vacuum on this while you're cruising to help evacuate extra pressure. It makes it more efficient, and the gaseous oil just gets sucked into your intake, and then it gets burned and goes through the cat and other emissions stuff. And the PCV valve closes during high vacuum, but most importantly, it closes during boost if you have a turbo engine. So as soon as the car goes into boost, this becomes pressurized, and you don't want the boost pressure going from the intake manifold into the valve cover and then down into the crankcase and pressurizing the motor, because you already have pressure that's being caused by blow-by through the combustion chambers. So this thing will shut off during boost, and that's why if you do run a PCV system, it is important to get that Mazda 323 GTX PCV valve, because it creates a much better seal in boost, and it's got metal internals, and it's just a better valve. So in boost, the only place the engine can breathe through is this breather port. And one of the primary reasons for catch cans and oil air separators is to make sure that you don't get the oil gases into the intake system, because it technically lowers the octane of the fuel. And that can cause detonation, which means engine damage. So before we get into the fun of painting this thing, let's disassemble it and see what's inside. Alright, so today I'll be making some internal modifications to my valve cover in order to help the crankcase breathe better, in case you haven't gathered that by now. Now this modification is for, I would say, anybody who's making more than stock power, but especially anyone who's running a forced induction system, supercharger, turbocharger. All those things are adding additional pressure into your crankcase, and that pressure has got to go somewhere. First thing to do is remove all of the Phillips head screws that hold on these little plates that cover up the internal chambers on the valve cover. The metal plates covering these chambers are pretty thin, so try not to completely mangle them. They will be stuck to the valve cover because they have like this, some kind of sealant on there. So here's the PCV side, and there are some baffles inside the chamber, but this side is actually much more free flowing than the breather side, which I'll get to in a minute. But as I discussed, the PCV valve actually closes in boost, which is the most important time to have airflow through the valve cover. So in this valve cover, I'm actually converting the PCV side into a full breather, which means it's not going to shut off during boost. And this is where the variations begin as far as what different people do to their valve covers, because some people just open up the breather side, they want to leave the PCV in place. Some people put steel wool or kitchen scrubbers inside these chambers to help stop oil from getting through, but other people report that those kitchen scrubbers actually made more oil come through the system. And how I formulated my plan here is I just read this mega thread that's on MiataTurbo, which I'll link down below, that's all about catch cans. So I read that, a bunch of other stuff, and that's how I came up with the exact setup that I'm gonna run here. And if you're not gonna do any research and just blindly follow this video, which I don't recommend, please note that deleting the PCV system and running dual open breathers is really only considered necessary if you have a very high powered Miata, or if you have a forced induction track car where you're spending a lot of time in boost. For the typical 200 or 250 horsepower street driven Miata, you can just port out the breather side and leave the PCV in place. Another option, if you wanted to keep the PCV system in place, is to pick up one of these SPS Motorsport valve covers where they have the PCV port still, but they have welded dual breather fittings into the valve cover. And I see that they make these for all years of Miatas, so that's another option. It is pretty expensive though, so I find that the procedure I'm doing here is kind of the best of both worlds. So anyways, this is essentially the entrance for air and oil vapors to get into that PCV chamber. And if I take the cover off here, you can see it goes through those little baffles, and then there is the grommet, which your PCV valve goes into normally. Over on the breather side, you can see we've got basically a completely open chamber, but there's actually two chambers that the air has to get through before it can exit the valve cover. So if I put the center cover back on, you can see there is a large opening here, and it's got like a splash guard protecting that opening, and that's so a ton of oil can't splash off the cams and get into these chambers. Now some oil and oil vapor is still going to get through there, and that's basically what causes your throttle body and your intake manifold to get all gunked up, but this thing does a pretty good job of stopping most of the oil. So once that air pressure gets into the center chamber, it's got to go through this tiny little passageway to get into the next chamber, goes through that, and then it's got another little passageway, and that's where it exits the valve cover and goes into your intake system. Those two openings are the most restrictive part in the whole system, and you can see here that they measure about 6.4 millimeters, and that's the first modification I'm going to make here, is opening up those passages. Before you drill, go ahead and pull out this little fitting. You can just get some vice grips and twist it until it comes out. It's pressed in, and you can mangle it because you're not going to be needing this anymore. Next up, grab that drill, and I used a 9mm drill bit, and since there's already a passage through here, you don't really have to worry about centering anything up. You can just drill right through it. Just make sure you don't drill too far and go through the top of your valve cover or something. Little side note here, if you are doing this on a 1.6 liter valve cover, this chamber is actually split into two, and there's an additional passage that has to get drilled out between between the two chambers. I chose this size because it's not so big that it's going to damage any of the surrounding area or the sealing surface of that plate. And you can see here that with a little wiggling of the drill bit, I was able to get 9.15 millimeter diameter through that passage. And that's an increase of 43% from stock. Now, I'm no physicist, but I do know that you can fit more air through a bigger hole. But we're not done there, because the exit from the valve cover is just as small if we were to retain that stock fitting and the stock rubber hose. So this is the part where we get to make our valve covers look absolutely sick from the outside by adding AN fittings. Everybody knows that real race cars have AN fittings, right? So I have two different sizes of drill bits and taps here. On the breather side, I'm using 3/8 NPT along with a 9/16 drill bit. And I'm using this size because it's about the biggest you can go before you start to compromise the little structure of the valve cover where the stock fitting goes in. How do I know this? Well, MiataTurbo.net user fourwhls actually did the groundwork here and uploaded a write-up for this process back in 2016, which I'm just replicating on my car. I'll link that thread down below as well if you want to check it out. So where that fitting used to be, you're just going to take your 9/16 drill bit and go all the way through. I suggest putting a rag inside the valve cover to kind of catch that drill bit so you don't do any unnecessary damage. Once the hole is drilled, you can tap it with your 3/8 NPT tap, and in case you've never used an NPT tap before, these threads are tapered, which means the farther you cut these threads in, the wider they get. So I recommend cutting a few threads and then testing out your fitting. And if it doesn't go far enough in, you can cut a few more, etc. What you don't want to do is cut the NPT threads so deep that your fitting bottoms out and then it won't seal. So this fitting is 3/8 NPT on one side and 10 AN on the other side. And the reason you don't have to use a welder is, well, obviously you just thread it into the valve cover. Now the inner diameter of 3/8 NPT is smaller than 10 AN, which means you are losing some inner diameter by doing it this way. But if you can see the measurement here, 10.4 millimeters is the inner diameter, which is larger than the pass-through port inside the valve cover. So it's really not causing any restriction. And it's still significantly bigger than what we had before. Now, if you're converting your PCV side of the valve cover to an open breather like I am, your next step will be to remove the PCV grommet and then drill this side for a 1/2" NPT fitting, which is a little bit larger, and that's going to take a 23/32 drill bit. Now, I know there's going to be someone in the comments making a meme about our crazy American drill bit sizes, but no need to worry. All you got to do is buy this kit right here, which comes with the right size tap and matching drill bit, and they're not that expensive. I got both of these drill and tap kits linked down in the description in case you're going to do this, and then you don't have to worry about shopping for an individual 398 443 of an inch drill bit. So get that hole punched out and tapped for your fitting. Now this is a 10 AN on one side and a 1/2" NPT on the other side, like I said, for that larger inner diameter. And at this point, the modifications to the valve cover are complete. You want to give it a good thorough clean, get all those shavings out of there before any reassembly. And in my case, I'm going to go ahead and get this thing repainted. I'll just hit it with a wire brush to get some of those loose paint flakes off. And then I wanted to try out a brand new paint stripper that I've never tried before called Citrus Strip. Now this is not sponsored, but I highly recommend picking some of this up if you're going to be painting anything. It's a nice thick gel, so it's easy to just paint on with a paintbrush. It smells great. And as you can see here, I wasn't even finished painting the valve cover and the paint is already coming up off of it, and basically just let it sit for half an hour or so. You'll see when the paint has kind of loosened up like this, and then you can just use a brush to get into any trouble spots, blast it with the garden hose, and all of the paint should come off, or so I thought. Okay, we gotta have a talk real quick. I know my hair's messed up, but this is important. When I originally painted the lettering on my valve cover, there were people in the comments telling me that the tester's model paint that I had selected was not gonna hold up to the heat of being on an engine and existing in the engine bay, okay? Which I was open to their criticism at the time. But let me show you what the valve cover looks like after a full round of high-powered paint stripper, being scrubbed with a steel wire brush, and then being blasted with a garden hose. Can't handle the heat of the engine bay? Bro, this paint could survive a nuclear blast. In conclusion, I highly recommend the Tester's Model Paint for any high temperature applications. Anyways, fortunately, after I let the industrial paint stripper sit on the lettering for 24 hours, it did actually come off. Okay, I just put the manifolds on and the valve cover just for mock-up, trying to figure out where to put the catch can. And this is my first time mocking up the Kraken exhaust manifold, and wow, that thing puts the turbo so far back. I think I'm actually gonna have extra room up front. I was wondering how they got the EFR to fit with the power steering and AC. And I know they say it's a super tight fit with power steering and AC, which means maybe you'll have to trim some stuff a little bit, but you can get it to work. But dude, I'm so pumped to get this thing on the dyno and see what it does. Let's move on to the catch can mounting location. Now, this is gonna vary based on the size of your catch can and what all you have going on in your engine bay. For my application, this thing fit very nicely right behind the radiator. And this is from a brand called Evil Energy. It's a pretty cheap catch can, but a catch can is a very simple device. This one does not have an air oil separator, nor does it need one, because I am just venting the valve cover into the catch can and then venting that to atmosphere. It's not actually going back into the motor or anything. And here's a quick look at my previous catch can, which was by Mishimoto. Now this does have an air oil separator in it, and this is the type of can you want to run if you're going to route the system back into your intake. This type of can acts as an intercept for either the PCV or the breather, or both. Some people run dual air oil separators on their engine, one on each side. And that setup is great for not allowing oil to get back into your intake system, but it does not increase the overall flow of anything, and it can't handle any additional blow-by. And you can see inside the can, this is probably 5,000 miles worth of oil that the separator was able to separate and not allow to go back into the intake system. Next up, I'll be custom building my AN10 lines. Over on the exhaust side, I just needed two 90-degree AN fittings and some AN10 hose, and I kind of wanted to put everything together like this to get an idea of how long the hose needed to be. There's no better way to mock up custom length parts than actually test fitting them on the engine. Over on the intake side, I just did the same thing with a 90-degree AN fitting, and I'll be using a straight fitting into the catch can just because the angle of the hose. Look at this engine bay, man. I got hose in different area codes, or however that song goes. Anyways, on to painting the valve cover. I'll be using my classic wrinkle black finish. You boys already know I got a video on this whole process of how to paint your valve cover wrinkle black. I'll link that down below in the description. And I know a lot of people are asking, well, what are you gonna do so the paint lasts longer this time? I'm not really worried about it. It lasted like 3 solid years, and I don't care if I have to repaint my valve cover every 3 years, but on the paint can, it does give you instructions on how to bake the paint. And I've done this with parts in the past, and it really makes the finish much more cured and hardened. I just didn't want to blow up my entire house with paint fumes this time around, so I'm just gonna send it and hope it lasts. And man, do I love me some wrinkle black. Just take a second and enjoy the finish on this thing. And no better way to finish off that wrinkle black than with some red lettering. Now, even though I do have a full video on this, there are a couple tips and tricks that I learned along the way here. You want to inject the paint into the bottom of the letters as far away from the walls of the letters as possible, because particularly with the wrinkle black, the paint actually wants to crawl up the wrinkles and crawl out of the letters, which makes like a spider web effect. And you don't want to add too much paint at a time. If the paint in the letters gets too thin, you can always add a drop here and there before it dries, and it'll totally smooth out. And this thing looks absolutely baller once again, and it looks even cooler with the AN fittings. So what do you say we get this thing on the engine and get all of our lines finalized? Once your hoses are cut to length, all you need to do to finish them is thread on this end cap from the fitting. Now these usually have reverse threads inside of them, so you'll spin it counterclockwise until you can see that the hose is bottomed out inside of that cap, and then thread it all the way on to the main part of the fitting. Now I use some kind of assembly lube or grease when I'm threading these on, and I also put a piece of masking tape around the hose so I can make sure that as I'm threading this in, it's not pushing the hose back out, because your hoses will leak if they get pushed out during the fitting assembly process. Now the hoses are all complete. The last step here is to just put everything back together. Now I didn't really see the need to reseal these plates with RTV or anything because they're not airtight, there's not pressure inside of them, and it doesn't really really matter if something leaks from one side to the other, but you can RTV them if you want to do that. Once your fittings are installed and the chamber plates are screwed back on tight, it's time to put the valve cover back on. And there is the final product: painted valve cover, AN10 fittings and black braided hoses, custom catch can setup. Now there are different ways you can mount your can and route the hoses and everything, so if you do a cool setup on your Miata, I'd love to see it. Post it up on Instagram and don't forget to tag me at the Car Passion channel. Alright guys, well that is the new catch can breather setup on the VVT Beast. I hope you did learn something in this video, but also keep in mind that a lot of the things I do to my car, I am trying myself for the first time, and it's really designed to be a learning experience that I'm going through that I want to share with you guys. So don't take every single thing I say and do as, you know, always the perfect or the best way to do things. If you think I could improve this setup, drop it down in the comments below. But I do know that I've seen it done this way before, and I know the crankcase on that car has to breathe better with how much boost I'm running, with how much power I'm running, with the bigger ring gaps. I need something that's better than the factory system, and I at least have a good starting point now. So if you like this video, don't forget to smash that thumbs up button, and I will see you on the next Miata Monday.